Let me get straight to it. I know people in our country are frustrated with our politics. I know they feel that much gets promised, but not enough is delivered. I know they watch the news or read the papers and wonder why, in the face of the facts as they have them, choices are made as they are. I know that they dislike Westminster game playing, the short-termism and the lack of accountability. But most of all, I think people are tired of the false choice between two versions of change that never go beyond a slogan. I've been Prime Minister for nearly a year now, and it is a privilege of my life. I know the fundamentals of our great country are solid and timeless. Its people are its greatest strength, economically and socially. Their hopes and genius are what propel us forward, not government. Government can set the framework, step in when needed, and step back when necessary. It can make big decisions. But what I've concluded during my time so far as Prime Minister is that those decisions, the decisions that could bring real change, change that could alter the trajectory of our country, can be so caveated, so influenced by special interests, so lacking in debate and fundamental scrutiny, that we've stumbled into a consensus about the future of our country that no one seems to be happy with. And this is because too often, motivated by short-term thinking, politicians have taken the easy way out, telling people the bits they want to hear, and not necessarily always the bits they need to hear. Now, we are making progress, including on my 5 priorities. Inflation, down again today and on track to be halved. Fastest growth in the G7 over the last 2 years. Debt on target to be falling. The NHS, treating more patients than last year. And small boats, crossing significantly down on last year. But put simply, that isn't enough. If for too many there remains a nagging sense that the path we're on, no matter which party is in government, isn't quite what we hoped for, and that no one seems to have the courage to say so. That we make too little, that we spend too much, that things take too long, and that even when we know these things, we seem powerless to change them. Now, I'm here today to tell you that we do not have to be powerless. Our future doesn't have to be a foregone conclusion. Our destiny can be our own choosing, but only if we change the way our politics works. Can we be brave in the decisions we make, even if there is a political cost? Can we be honest when the facts change, even if it's awkward? And can we put the long-term interests of our country before the short-term political needs of the moment, even if it means being controversial? I've spent my first year as Prime Minister bringing back stability to our economy, your government, and our country. And now it is time to address the bigger long-term questions we face. The real choice confronting us is, do we really want to change our country and build a better future for our children? Or do we want to carry on as we are? I've made my decision. We are going to change. And over the coming months, I will set out a series of long-term decisions to deliver that change. And that starts today with a new approach to one of the biggest challenges we face, climate change. No one can watch the floods in Libya or the extreme heat in Europe this summer and doubt that it is real and happening. We must reduce our emissions. And when I look at our economic future, I see huge opportunities in green industry. The change in our economy is as profound as the Industrial Revolution, and I'm confident that we can lead the world now as we did then. So I'll have no truck with anyone saying we lack ambition. But there's nothing ambitious about simply asserting a goal for a short-term headline without being honest with the public about the tough choices and sacrifices involved, and without any meaningful democratic debate about how we get there. The Climate Change Committee have rightly said, you don't reach net zero simply by wishing it. Yet that's precisely what previous governments have done, both Labour and Conservative. No one in Westminster politics has yet had the courage to look people in the eye and explain what's really involved. That's wrong, and it changes now. The plans made on your behalf assume this country will take an extraordinary series of steps that will fundamentally change our lives. a ban on buying new boilers, even if your home will never ever be suitable for a heat pump, a ban that takes effect in just 3 years for those off the gas grid, and mandatory home upgrades for property owners in just 2 years' time. There have even been proposals for taxes on eating meat, new taxes on flying, compulsory car sharing if you drive to work, and a government diktat to sort your rubbish into 7 different bins. Now, I believe deeply that when you ask most people about climate change, they want to do the right thing. They're even prepared to make sacrifices. But it cannot be right for Westminster to impose such significant costs on working people, especially those who are already struggling to make ends meet, and to interfere so much in people's way of life without a properly informed national debate. That's especially true because we're so far ahead of every other country in the world. We've had the fastest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the G7, down almost 50% since 1990. France, 22%. The US, no change at all. China, up by 300%. And when our share of global emissions is less than 1%, how can it be right that British citizens are now being told to sacrifice even more than others? Because the risk here, for those of us who care about reaching net zero, as I do, is simple. If we continue down this path, we risk losing the consent of the British people. And the resulting backlash would not just be against specific policies, but against the wider mission itself, meaning we might never achieve our goal. That's why we have to do things differently. We need sensible green leadership. It won't be easy, and it will require a wholly new kind of politics. A politics that is transparent and the space for a better, more honest debate about how we secure the country's long-term interests. So how do we do that? What is our new approach to achieving net zero? Well, first, we need to change the debate. We're stuck between 2 extremes. Those who want to abandon net zero altogether because the costs are too high, the burden's too great, or in some cases, they don't accept the overwhelming evidence for climate change at all. And then there are others who argue with an ideological zeal, we must move even faster and go even further, no matter the cost or disruption to people's lives, and regardless of how much quicker we're already moving than any other country. Both extremes are wrong. Both fail to reckon with the reality of the situation. Yes, net zero is going to be hard and will require us to change. But in a democracy, we must also be able to scrutinise and debate those changes, many of which are hidden in plain sight, in a realistic manner. This debate needs more clarity, not more emotion. The test should be, do we have the fairest credible path to reach net zero by 2050 in a way that brings people with us? Since I've become Prime Minister, I've examined our plans, and I don't think they meet that test. We seem to have defaulted to an approach which will impose unacceptable costs on hard-pressed British families, costs that no one was ever really told about, and which may not actually be necessary to deliver the emissions reduction that we need. And why am I confident in saying that? Because over the last decade or more, we've massively over-delivered on every one of our carbon budgets, despite continuous predictions we'd miss them. We've seen rapid technological advances, which have made things like renewables far cheaper. Just consider offshore wind, where costs have fallen by 70% more than we projected in 2016. And people are increasingly choosing to go green. Look at how demand for electric vehicles has consistently outstripped forecasts. Now, given all these things, I'm confident that we can adopt a more pragmatic, proportionate, and realistic approach to meeting net zero that eases the burdens on working people. And that's the second part of our new approach. Now, I'm not saying there will be no hard choices, and nor am I abandoning any of our targets and commitments. I am unequivocal that we will meet our international agreements, including the critical promises in Paris and Glasgow to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. I'm proud that our country leads the world on net zero with the most ambitious 2030 target of any major economy. And as we're committed as ever to helping developing countries. Just the other week, I announced $2 billion for the Green Climate Fund, the single biggest commitment of its kind the UK has ever made. But we can do all of this in a fairer, better way. And today I can set out details of what our new approach will mean for people. That starts with electric vehicles. We're working hard to make the UK a world leader. I'm proud that we've already attracted billions of new investments from companies like Tata's Jaguar Land Rover Gigafactory. And I expect that by 2030, the vast majority of cars sold will be electric. Why? Because the costs are reducing, the range is improving, the charging infrastructure is growing. People are already choosing electric vehicles to such an extent that we're registering a new one every 60 seconds. But I also think that, at least for now, it should be you, the consumer, that makes that choice, not government forcing you to do it. Because the upfront cost still is high, especially for families struggling with the cost of living. Small businesses are worried about the practicalities. And we've got further to go to get the charging infrastructure truly nationwide. And we need to strengthen our own auto industry so we aren't reliant on heavily subsidised, carbon-intensive imports from countries like China. So to give us more time to prepare, I'm announcing today that we're going to ease the transition to electric vehicles. You'll still be able to buy petrol and diesel cars and vans until 2035. Even after that, you'll still be able to buy and sell them second-hand. We're aligning our approach with countries like Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Australia, Canada, Sweden, and US states such as California, New York, and Massachusetts, and still ahead of the rest of America and other countries like New Zealand. Now, to get to net zero, we also need a fairer, better approach to decarbonising how we heat our homes. We're making huge advances in the technologies that we need to do that, like heat pumps. But we need a balance between incentivising businesses to innovate so heat pumps become even cheaper, more effective and more attractive, but without imposing costs on hard-pressed families at a time when technology is often still expensive and won't work in all homes. For a family living in a terraced house in Darlington, the upfront cost could be around £10,000. Now, even the most committed advocates of net zero must recognise that if our solution is to force people to pay that kind of money, support will collapse and will simply never get there. So I'm announcing today that we will give people far more time to make the necessary transition to heat pumps. We'll never force anyone to rip out their existing boiler and replace it with a heat pump. You'll only ever have to make the switch when you're replacing your boiler anyway, and even then, not until 2035. And to help those households for whom this will be the hardest, I'm introducing a new exemption today so that they will never have to switch at all. Now, this doesn't mean I'm any less committed to decarbonising our homes. Quite the opposite. But rather than banning boilers before people can afford the alternative, we're going to support them to make the switch. I'm announcing today that the boiler upgrade scheme, which gives people cash grants to replace their boiler, will be increased by 50% to £7,500. There are no strings attached, the money will never need to be repaid, and this is one of the most generous schemes of its kind in Europe. Next, energy efficiency. Now, this is critical to making our homes cheaper to heat. That's why we've got big government grants, like the Great British Insulation Scheme. But under current plans, some property owners would have been forced to make expensive upgrades in just 2 years' time. For a semi-detached house in Salisbury, you could be looking at a bill of £8,000. And even if you're only renting, you'll more than likely see some of that passed on in higher rents. That's just wrong. So those plans will be scrapped. And while we will continue to subsidise energy efficiency, we'll never force any household to do it. And that's not all. The debate about how we get to net zero has thrown up a range of worrying proposals, and today I want to confirm that under this government, they will never happen. The proposal for government to interfere in how many passengers you can have in your car, I've scrapped it. The proposal that we should force you to have 7 different bins in your home, I've scrapped it. The proposal to make you change your diet and harm British farmers by taxing meat, or to create new taxes to discourage flying or going on holiday, I've scrapped those too. And nor will we ban new oil and gas in the North Sea, which would simply leave us reliant on expensive imported energy from foreign dictators like Putin. We will never impose these unnecessary and heavy-handed measures on you, the British people. But we will still meet our international commitments and hit net zero by 2050. And if we're going to change politics in the way I'm talking about, we can never allow carbon budgets to be set in the same way again. The last carbon budget process was debated in the House of Commons for just 17 minutes and voted through with barely any consideration given to the hard choices needed to fulfill it. It was the carbon equivalent of promising to boost government spending with no way to pay for it. That's not a responsible way to make decisions which have such a bearing on people's lives. So when Parliament votes on carbon budgets in the future, I want to see it consider the plans to meet that budget at the same time. If the first part of our new approach to meeting net zero is to change the debate, and the second part is a more pragmatic, proportionate, and realistic approach that eases the burdens on families, then the third is to embrace with even greater enthusiasm the incredible opportunities of green industry and take the necessary practical steps to create whole new sectors and hundreds of thousands of good, well-paid jobs right across the country. We're already home to 4 of the world's largest offshore wind farms. We're building an even bigger one in Dogger Bank and improving our auction process to maximise private investment into this world-leading industry. We're lifting the ban on onshore wind. We're investing in 4 new clusters to capture and store carbon from the atmosphere. And we're building new nuclear power stations for the first time in 30 years. Just this week, we took a significant long-term decision to raise funding for Sizewell C, putting beyond all doubt our commitment to decarbonising our power sector. And later this autumn, we'll shortlist the companies to build a new generation of small modular reactors. But one of our biggest constraints to reaching net zero and improving our energy security is this. We're investing billions in new energy projects, yet we don't have the grid infrastructure to bring that power to households and businesses. And when energy security is national security, that's unacceptable. Right now, it can take 14 years to build new grid infrastructure. There are enough projects waiting to be connected to generate over half of our future electricity needs. So I can announce today that the Chancellor and Energy Security Secretary will shortly bring forward comprehensive new reforms to energy infrastructure. We'll set out the UK's first ever spatial plan for that infrastructure to give industry certainty and every community a say. We'll speed up planning for the most nationally significant projects, and we'll end the first come, first served approach to grid connections by raising the bar to enter the queue and make sure those ready first will connect first. So from offshore wind to nuclear to a revolution in our energy infrastructure, investors should have absolute confidence that we're getting on with the job and the UK will remain the best place in the world to invest in the green industries of the future. Not least because of something else that this country has always excelled at, innovation in new technologies. As a country that emits less than 1% of the world's carbon emissions, one of the most powerful contributions we can make is our unique ability to develop new technologies that can help the world. Like the Sense Wind team in Scotland developing the technology to service offshore floating wind turbines while still out at sea. Or the researchers at Cambridge who pioneered a new way to turn sunlight into fuel. And that's why today we're going further, creating the new £150 million Green Future Fellowship. This will support at least 50 leading scientists and engineers to develop real, breakthrough green technologies. And it builds on the £1 billion I invested as Chancellor in the Net Zero Innovation Portfolio. And finally, we can't tackle climate change without protecting nature, and vice versa. Just the loss of forests alone accounts for the equivalent of 10 times the global emissions of the entire United Kingdom. And in the coming weeks, ahead of my attendance at COP28, I will set out the next stage in our ambitious environmental agenda. So in conclusion, this country is proud to be a world leader in reaching net zero by 2050. But we simply won't achieve it unless we change. We're now going to have a better, more honest debate about how we get there. We'll now have a more pragmatic, proportionate and realistic approach that eases the burdens on families, all while doubling down on the new green industries of the future. In a democracy, that's the only realistic path to net zero. Consent, not imposition. Honesty, not obfuscation. Pragmatism, not ideology. That's how we'll turn the challenge of net zero into the greatest opportunity and the proudest achievement of our lifetimes. And this is just the start. What we begin today is bigger than any single policy or issue. We are going to change the way our politics works. We are going to make different decisions. We won't take the easy way out. There will be resistance, but we will meet it, because I am determined to change our country and build a better future for our children. Nothing less is acceptable. I've turned some questions from the media. Could we start with the BBC, please?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Chris Mason, BBC News. Boris Johnson says you're faltering. Businesses say you've robbed them of certainty, and one of your former cabinet colleagues suggests that this risks putting you on the wrong side of history. Is this all because you're panicking about losing the election?
I've been thinking about these issues for a long time, and as Chancellor, I was concerned about the impact on families of some of the policies that were being mooted. When you think about it, as I mentioned, policies that would cost a typical family around the country £5,000, £10,000, £15,000, and we seem to be on autopilot to just adopt these things. I didn't think that was right at the time, and now as Prime Minister, I've got an opportunity to change things. And what I don't want to do is make yet more short-term decisions, easy ways out that ultimately not be straight with the country about what those mean for them, the costs that those are imposing on them. I don't believe that's the right thing to do. I want to make the right decisions for the long term of our children, of our country, and that won't be easy. And as you can see, there's lots of resistance to what I'm saying today. But what I'm trying to do is make sure that we're on a path to deliver net zero, because I firmly believe in it, but we're going to do that in a fair, in a proportionate way that brings people along with us and minimises the burdens on families. Now, I think that's an incredibly reasonable and realistic approach. In fact, I think it's the only approach that's going to actually get us to net zero and carry the country with us. So look, lots of people are going to have their views, and I respect their right to disagree with me, but ultimately it's incumbent on them to then explain to families up and down the country why, if they disagree with me, they're willing to impose those costs, £10,000, £15,000 on those families in pursuit of something when it's not necessary, when we can meet our carbon targets without it, when we remain a world leader. Right? That's a question for them, because I think my approach is the right one. Next, can we go to ITV?
Prime Minister, you know probably better than anyone that we've had years of underinvestment caused by economic instability, which has in turn led to low growth. When you became Prime Minister, you pledged to restore stability. By delaying the targets for motor vehicle replacement, boiler replacement, many big businesses that want to invest in this country say you've pulled the rug from under them and you've increased instability. The reverse of what you wanted to do, you said.
The best thing I can do for business is ensure that we actually continue to deliver net zero because it has the consent of the British public. And as you can see in other countries around the world, when people have tried to go too fast, haven't had an open and honest conversation with the country, they've ultimately had to change course. That's not the right thing to do. And that's what we're doing today. We're putting in place the right policies that will ensure that we get to net zero, bring people along with us, and that's what ultimately will give businesses the certainty that they need to invest. You mentioned a couple of specific things, the time frame for transitioning electric vehicles. As I pointed out, 2035, that's the same target as that in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Canada, Australia, California. I can go on. That is the global mainstream target. In an industry that is global in nature with imports and exports that we are integrated into, it's hard for anyone to say that that is somehow putting us at a disadvantage. I also think what the auto industry wants us to deliver, which we will now be able to, is our mandate to get from here to there. Because, as I said, this is about 2035 is one aspect of it, but between now and then, we are going to make progress in transitioning to electric vehicles. And we're working with industry, put in place the pathway to get there that they are incredibly supportive of. The other thing I would say to industry is we're doubling down on the other things that they want from us, and that's grid infrastructure. If I speak to any business today that is interested in this space, and my cabinet colleagues over there will be nodding, right? If you speak to Mark, speak to Kemi, speak to Claire, what does every business ask them about? How do we connect to the grid faster? We want to decarbonise. We want to grow. But if it's going to take us years to connect, that's not going to work. We're not going to get to energy security or net zero that way. That's why the reforms that I announced today that the Chancellor and the Energy Security Secretary will flesh out in more detail in the coming weeks will make a transformative difference for business, and particularly those in the power sector, those companies that are queuing up to deliver more renewables, and you'll know that because you speak to them as well, Robert. They'll all be asking about grid connections, but we're about to bring forward the most transformative plans that anyone has done to upgrade our grid infrastructure and speed up connections to it. So I think any which way you look at it, we're continuing to do the right things for business, whether it's investing in R&D to realise the benefits of innovation. Again, that's something we can do better than almost anyone. Speeding up grid connections, but most importantly, providing the certainty and clarity that we have a path that is sustainable because it's going to be done with people's consent. And I think that is something that they will prize above everything else. Next, we'll go to GB News.
Prime Minister, you mentioned there the unacceptable costs on hard-pressed British families. How much will these changes save the average working family? And you talk about consent. Why not put net zero by 2050 to a referendum with the British people?
Well, when it comes to the costs, I think you're absolutely right to highlight them. And that's why I've taken the decision that I've taken, because some of the things that were being proposed would have cost typical families upwards of £5,000, £10,000, £15,000. Obviously, it depends on the type of property you live in, but for some people off the gas grid, forcing them to install a heat pump would have meant not just the cost of a heat pump, which could be in property like that, something like £13,000 instead of the boiler that they would have done, but also could have meant that they had to make costly improvements to their energy efficiency at the same time, which could have been upwards of £20,000. Now, that's to give you a sense of the scale. Or you take energy efficiency upgrades, which, again, we were 2 years away from imposing on people. The average cost of those energy efficiency upgrades is about £8,000. For a quarter of all households, they're well upwards of 10. Right? These are the types of numbers that we're talking about. So, look, I get that lots of people out there are going to be critical of what I'm doing today. They'll have their own views. But as I said earlier, I guess the question for all those people who are criticising this approach is to ask them to justify to all those families up and down the country why they think it's right, to ask them to find £5,000, £10,000, £15,000, £20,000 at a time when budgets are obviously tight, because we're working on getting inflation down, in pursuit of a goal that we can deliver without doing those things in a measured way, and still at the same time be world leading with our ambition. That's the question for everyone else. I'm interested in doing the right long-term thing for the country and actually bringing people along with me and minimising those costs on families. And that's why I think what we're announcing today, it is a break from the past, it is a change. It's a different way to approach these decisions, but I think it's the right thing to do, and I think it will have very broad support in the country.
Referendum?
No, I think we've had enough referendums, quite frankly. But I think the point about consent is important, and that's motivating me to do what I'm doing today. As I said, we haven't had an honest conversation about these issues in a long time. right? It's not enough to just announce these targets, because it's a great headline in the short term, but kind of will this thing to happen. That's not right. That's not the type of leadership that I believe in, right? I'm Prime Minister. I want to be upfront and honest about what we're doing. I believe in net zero. We're going to get to net zero, but we're going to do it in a fair and proportionate way that is mindful of the impact on families. I'm absolutely confident we can do it. We're going to double down in all the areas where we can make a massive difference. We're going to save people money in the process, but throughout, we will do it with people's consent, because that is how we're going to bring them along with us. And if we don't do that, those of us who believe in delivering it will lose people. And that's not right. And that's what I'd say to those people on the extremes of this debate, the people who approach this with an ideological zeal that they will happily pay any price, they'll impose any cost on families in pursuit of it. That's not right. And what you will end up doing is damaging the cause of net zero, because people will be turned off. And I don't want to see that happen. Next, we go to the Times.
Prime Minister, you've talked about phasing out the installation of new gas boilers from 2035. I've just been reading the Heat and Building Strategy from 2021, and it has exactly the same policy. So how is the policy you're announcing today any different from what the government's already committed to?
So when it comes to heat, there are a range of different things that were being proposed. And of course, look, it's right, we need to decarbonise our heat first and foremost, right? Everyone who believes in net zero has to acknowledge that over time we need to change how we heat our homes. I want to be upfront with everyone about that, because that's what's necessary. I wouldn't be being straight with you if I was on the one hand saying we're going to deliver net zero, but then pretending that we weren't going to have to change how we heat our homes. We do, but we can do it in a much more measured way. Now, there were a range of things that were being proposed. In just a couple of years, some property owners were being forced to massively upgrade the energy efficiency of their homes at an average cost of about £8,000. We've stopped that from happening. A year after that, we were proposing that those off the gas grid were going to have to make changes to their boilers. And as I said, for many of those people, this was exorbitantly expensive or actually just deeply impractical. We've stopped that from happening. And for everybody else, we will have to make the change. Right? 2035 is the right type of time frame, because boilers on average last about 15 years. And if we want to get to 2050 and be net zero compliant, you work backwards, that's about the right time frame. So we shouldn't be doing things before then, but that's a sensible time frame to do it. But as I've announced today, we recognise that there are a number of properties for whom this just won't make sense with the technology and what we know today. And that's why we're introducing a new exemption, which will cover about a fifth of all households. But there are those houses up and down the country, either the extra improvements they have to make for their grid connection or the energy efficiency improvements they would have to make to install the heat pump, just either are not practically feasible or so disproportionately expensive that it's not right. So that new exemption today is a new policy, and as well as shifting the timelines out to 25. But again, also, because I am committed to doing this, I'm being upfront that that will need to happen, and we're supporting people today to make the change. So we have a scheme called the Boiler Scrappage Scheme, which provides families with £5,000 right now if you want to make that transition yourself. I'm increasing that today by 50% to £7,500. Now, that's a significant increase. It means it's one of the most generous schemes in Europe, but also roughly that £7,500 is about the difference between a typical heat pump and a typical boiler. Obviously, it will vary by circumstances, but what we're saying is, for those people who want to do this, we're going to step in and help you in the short term. That will help grow the industry, get more people adopting this technology and spreading the word, and it's a signal of our intent to make this transition. But that's the right way to do it, not to impose disproportionate bans and mandates on people in the next few years that just come with a huge cost when the technology is not quite ready. Next, we go to the Daily Mail.
Thanks, PM. Jason Groves from the Daily Mail. You mentioned the government's carbon budgets. They're legally binding. Some of this other stuff is in law. Can you deliver this package without changing the law? And we've heard from some people on your own benches there is opposition on your side to some of this. Are you confident you can win those votes? You're the chief whip lurking over there. What's he telling you? Can you carry the party on this?
On the first one, I just want to be absolutely unequivocal about this. We remain completely 100% committed to all our targets, both our international targets, Paris, COP, but also our domestic targets. The nationally determined contributions to 2030 target, all of those remain. Not just are we committed to them, though, we are confident of delivering them. Energy Security Secretary and I have spent a lot of time since she got the job to go over all of this, and we are entirely confident that even with these changes, we are still on track to meet all our obligations. And obviously, as you'll know, under the legislation that we have that you pointed to, the Energy Security Secretary has an ongoing responsibility to ensure that we're on track and does regular reviews of all this under Section 13 of the Climate Change Act, and we will continue to do all of that. And that's why I'm confident I can stand here today and make these announcements, whilst also saying that we are confident that we can continue to deliver on all our commitments. And look, on your second question about people who disagree, as I said, there can be a range of different opinions on this. I accept that this is a controversial topic, but I think the debate on this has been charged with far too much emotion and not enough clarity. Right? And there are people on extremes of this debate from either side. I don't think those extremes are right. I think the broad majority of people in this country, they believe in net zero, they're prepared to sacrifice for net zero, but they just want that to be done in a proportionate, pragmatic, and realistic way, and they want people to be honest with them about what's involved. And that's the approach that we're putting in place today. And for those people who disagree with that, as I said, it's on them to explain to families around the country why, if they disagree with me, they think that those families should be forced to pay £5,000, £10,000, £15,000 to do things that are not necessary to get us to net zero, and at a time when budgets are already tight, and we continue to lead the world in bringing down carbon emissions. And as I said, I hope that as now people, rather than looking at the speculation, but having now seen what I've actually said and the detail of what we're saying, can digest it, absorb it, and I think it will command very broad support, not just in our party, but also in the country. Next, The Sun.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Harry Cole from The Sun. You say you're changing gear and going to make some very big policy announcements and big high-risk decisions in the coming months. Is this the start of some sort of political baseball to try and turn that 20-point poll deficit around? And on a theme, you say you want to be honest and open about hard choices. Is HS2 next? Can you guarantee that it remains your government policy for a high-speed rail train to go from Euston to central Manchester? Thank you.
Well, look, it's a very generous comparison to baseball, which as a cricket fan I will certainly bank. But look, no, this is not actually about politics. Right? This is not about the politics. This is about doing what's right for the country in the long term. This is about me having had this job for just under a year, thinking hard about the things that will make real difference, that will bring real change to this country, that will put this country on a different trajectory and build a better future for our children, and recognising that those decisions are going to be controversial. But I'm going to do the right thing, and that's the change that I'm going to bring, because we can't deliver that better future for the country. We can't deliver the change that people want to see unless we change how we do politics, and this is an example of that. Now, I'm not going to speculate on all the other things, but this is something that many people have grappled with for a long time, and what I want to do, as I said, is bring transparency and clarity to this debate and set out a very clear direction of travel, which I appreciate is different from what's gone before, but I'm not apologising for that, because I think this approach is the right one. And this one is the one that I think the country deserves. This is what the country needs, and this is what we will deliver.
HS2?
As I said, I'm not going to speculate on lots of the other things that people will be talking about. What I'm focused on today is something that the Sun in particular has been campaigning on for a long time, is finding a fair, proportionate, pragmatic way to deliver net zero, bring the country along with us, and that's what we're delivering today. Next, can we go to The Guardian?
Thanks, Prime Minister. Pippa Carrera from The Guardian. I think a lot of people listening to you will be wondering what exactly you're going to do to replace the specific targets that you're rolling back on today in order to meet that net zero target for 2050. Can you give us a bit more specific idea of how you're going to do that? And also, if I can ask, you've often said that your daughters are the experts on climate change in your household. How are you going to explain your decision to water down your climate targets today to them? And do you think they'll buy it?
So in terms of meeting our climate obligations, I guess it's the same answer that I've given before. The Secretary of State has an ongoing responsibility to ensure that we're on track to deliver all our commitments. We believe we are. There are obviously regular reviews of that happen, but because of all the things that I talked about earlier, the fact that we've consistently over-delivered, the fact that costs are coming down faster than we expected, the fact that adoption is happening faster than we thought. Those are all reasons, as well as the myriad of other policies that are in the mix. There's over 100 different policies that are all play a part in helping us deliver our goals. So it's not as simple as one in, one out. You have to constantly look at that entire mix of things, how they're delivering, what the environment is, and that's how the Secretary of State makes our regular assessments. But we believe we are absolutely on track to deliver our commitments, which again, as I would iterate, and this goes to your second point, about which I just disagree with. I think it is absolutely wrong to describe in any way, shape or form what I am doing today as watering down our targets. Our targets remain, right? Our commitment to net zero and the Paris and COP agreements that we signed remains. And our nationally determined contribution, our 2030 target, remains. And again, just for clarity, because this is the only thing that everyone is consistent on, we are forecast and we have committed to reduce our carbon emissions by 2030 by 68%. There is no other advanced economy in the world who comes close to that kind of commitment. That's a commitment that we're sticking to today. It's a commitment that we're confident we can deliver. Just to give you a sense, we're at 68%. Where's the EU? 55%. Australia, 45%. America, Japan, 40%. Canada, 20%. New Zealand, 18%. Right? So this idea that we're watering down our targets is just wrong, right? And this goes to this debate where there's all this emotion in it and people on extremes, but those are the facts. So if someone thinks that what we're doing is somehow not sufficient, not ambitious enough, I don't know what they'd say to pretty much every other country in the world, because we are way out ahead already and continuing to maintain that leadership. So I'm very confident that what we're doing is right, because not only do we have these world-leading targets, we're actually just doing it in a better way that will bring the country along with us and save families thousands of pounds. And there's nothing watering down about that. But that's why I have no problem whatsoever defending it, not just to my daughters, who, quite frankly, these aren't, it's not them who are going to have to fork out 10 grand, right? This is the families up and down the country right now who are working hard. Inflation is higher than any of us would like it to be, but thankfully today the numbers show that we're on track to bring it down. And the question is, I don't want those families to have to bear unnecessary costs at the same time as delivering all these things, and we don't have to. So I'm entirely comfortable with what I'm doing, and I think it's entirely wrong to describe it in any way, shape or form as watering anything down. And lastly, LBC.
Hi, Natasha Clark, LBC. Theresa May brought in the net zero target in 2019, as you know. Why has it taken the Conservative Party 4 years to be honest about the cost of net zero and what it all means for us? And will you now be honest today and admit that despite this delay, despite these pushing back, getting to net zero will cost Britain and the taxpayer quite a lot of money?
I don't think this is about actually individuals or personalities. As I said in my speech, right, look, we talk about net zero in 2008, the original act, and I think both parties over that long period of time, haven't had this honest conversation with the country about what exactly is involved. And there are lots of reasons for that, but it's not easy, right? You can see all the flack I'm getting today and yesterday because trying to have this conversation when it's charged with so much emotion, when there's people who are just very ideological about it, is not an easy thing to do. But that's not going to stop me from doing what I believe is right. Right, so I'm not going to chase the short-term headline. I'm not going to take the easy way out. That's not how I'm going to do this job. I am going to bring change because I want to put this country on a different trajectory. I want a better future for our children, and we're not going to get that unless we change how we do things. And today is the first example of a big change in approach, a change in the way we do politics, to put the long-term interests of the country first, ahead of the short-term and chasing the easy way out. And as I said, I think it's the right thing to do, and I genuinely believe it will command very broad support. Thank you very much for your time.